What's going on, fantasy owners? Another edition of the Fantasy Football Stock Report coming at you. It is playoff time. Probably just starting for a lot of you this week. Maybe some of you are in the semifinal mode already this week. I know in my league, it is semifinal because there's only 4 teams out of the 12 that make the playoffs. Luckily for me, as you probably saw in my feed, I was one of those guys again this year. 9-5 regular season. Got the wild card spot by points alone over a guy that had to lose in order for me to get that spot. So very, very huge for me that I'm in this week. And if you guys are watching these videos, hopefully that means that you guys are in too, and you're probably thinking to yourselves, okay, I need the best matchups now going forward to go for that championship. We're going for the whole kit and caboodle. It's not just good enough to get to the playoffs. Your goal when you play fantasy football is you want to go all the way and you want to win. You want to win some hardware. Like this, for example, the one that I won in 2010. So that's what you want to go for. That's what it's all about right now going forward. So this is the guys to ride video. These are guys that you turn down a little bit. Sorry, guys. These are the guys that you want to play. These are the guys that we're gonna really, hopefully rely on for big weeks this week. Have some awesome matchups. Guys that we've been relying on, some of them even all year. So these are guys you definitely want to get into your fantasy lineups for this critical time of year this week. So again, and just in general, again, I want to say thank you all so much to all the subscribers, all the guys who viewed my videos throughout the year. Again, I thank you so much for that. And I even got a chance to chat with a few of you. Well, I don't know about a few, maybe one of you. I love answering your guys' comments, questions, talking about this with you guys. Love it. But I know you're tired of hearing me blabbing about that. Let's dive right in to the guys that you want to play this week. Quarterbacks this week. The first name that I'm going to mention on here might surprise you because I said last week, I made the comment last week that if you started any Eagles players except for Bryce Brown, that you kind of were playing with fire because they hadn't really, hadn't had really a chance to gel yet, at least at certain positions. But I gotta say, I'm starting to kind of buy into Nick Foles. He has definitely looked the part the last 2 weeks as a solid fantasy producer. He had 35 fantasy points last week in a CBS league. And your score might be different, but still, he puts up good numbers. So he's definitely starting to fill in the role. Granted, now let's say what he's not. He's not Michael Vick. We know that will not be duplicated. He doesn't have the running ability anyway, but he certainly has the throwing ability. He's definitely getting Jeremy Maclin more involved. He's getting other guys like Riley Cooper more involved. Jason Avant is getting more involved in the offense now. So these guys definitely are, taking advantage of what Foles is able to do. This week, going up against Cincinnati on Thursday night, Cincinnati's D has looked strong at times this year, other times not so much. So you know what? At this point in the year, you're riding guys that you've rode all year to this point. But if you're not thrilled with your number 1 quarterback matchup this week, maybe you plug in Foles as a number 2 guy. That's really the only way I can see him right now because hasn't played a whole lot this year, but he's definitely looked the part the last few weeks. So yeah, I think it's time to slightly buy in on his on these numbers and definitely go with him as a decent number 2 guy. A guy that you want to welcome back this week, definitely looked the part last week, and I think he's back to being a must-start option again. Big Ben Roethlisberger. He's back in Pittsburgh. Showed no ill effects from the injuries that he suffered a couple weeks ago with that shoulder and rib issue. He's right back to being a quality fantasy producer, and at this time of year, that's definitely critical. The matchup this week going up against Dallas, granted it's on the road, but again, Dallas's D, nothing to really sneeze at, nothing to be really overexcited about. I think Big Ben is definitely a strong play for you this week. If you've kind of had him on your bench in the meantime while he's been out and hurt, if you've held on to him, had the roster space to keep him on your bench, I think you can definitely plug him back in this week as a solid must-start option for you. Kind of another surprising name that I know might surprise a lot of you, but this is just going off of the matchup alone for this guy this week, and that's Phillip Rivers of San Diego. Wait. Before you throw all your balls of paper at the screen in frustration and boo, hear me out on him, okay? I know Phillip Rivers has been a big-time fantasy disappointment this year. I understand that. Not that I have him, I don't, but I know he's been hair puller extreme this year. But hear me out. He is making Danario Alexander a stud receiver these last couple weeks. So with him involved, Rivers' value is rising. And they play the Panthers this week, whose defense isn't exactly stellar. So with that and the matchup alone, I don't think you can really fully ignore Rivers this week. Now, would I say he's a must start? No, because obviously you always run the risk that he's going to have a fallback week. But still, I think with the matchup that presents itself, I'm rating him as a number 2 with some upside, not like major league buku off the level ding the bell up to the top standpoint by any means. But I think he's certainly got the potential this week to have a big week for you. So number 2 option with some upside. Whoever is starting at quarterback for the Washington Redskins this week, you're going to want to start. Obviously, the matchup is juicy this week going up against Cleveland. Again, not a great defense. They've been destroyed at times this season, obviously, and Washington has been really hot of late. They're in the playoff race. Oh, sorry. They're even in the wild card chase. So there's definitely there. Obviously, the concern with RG3, that knee issue, it looked really wicked when we saw it last week, and all his owners went, took a big gasp and thought, oh my, I fear the worst. But thankfully, we heard it was just a sprain. Still a lot of uncertainty, though, whether or not he's actually going to play. They're hearing different reports. I think his dad said, yeah, he's going to play. I think other sources have, said that maybe he went into practice today and looked a little rough around the edges. So it's really up in the air at this point. But I think, though, even if Kirk Cousins has to start and get the role this week, I think he's still a decent option. And maybe a guy who can plug in, because he showed when RG3 went out last week that he could still take the reins and be a very capable quarterback. So I know Kirk Cousins play. He's a Big Ten alum. And so I know what he has been capable of. Living in Big Ten country, I've seen him, so I know what he's all about, and he's definitely shown that he can be a very strong quarterback. So I think whichever one of these guys, obviously if RG3 is playing, you're starting him. That's a given. But even if Cousins starts, I still think he could be a pretty solid option for you. And finally, this week, we have to talk about the team that's playing the Arizona Cardinals, and yes, it's my Detroit Lions. This is an awesome, awesome match this week. How hard is it right now to be an Arizona Cardinal fan? Seriously, Arizona, man, we feel for you guys right now. Maybe some of us do, but I think a lot of us do. This is a next level stat that blew my mind. They are the only team in NFL history to start a season 4-0 and then lose 9 straight games, including last week's 58-0 thrashing at the hands of the Seattle Seahawks. That was just a complete and utter shock to me. When I saw the score, I'm thinking that's got to be a misprint. No, this is the NFL. No team should lose that bad in the NFL, but it happened. It was just mind-blowing. So now, that the Lions are literally licking their chops to take on this Arizona team that just got blasted by the Seahawks, and when one of their own players, Larry Fitzgerald's father, said the team is quitting. That is just, and Ken Wisenhunt's job is probably going to be over at the end of the year if they keep on this losing. It might be over now. That game alone, called an embarrassment by their GM, might not be enough. So you are starting the vast majority of Lions offensive players this week. You are starting. You are starting Matthew Stafford. You are starting Mikael LaShore. You might even consider starting Jake Bell as a number 2, number 3 guy. If you have him on your bench, you might even consider him. He might get some garbage time if this turns into a blowout. You're definitely starting Megatron. You might even start his, there's not a whole lot of backup receivers there, but Mike Thomas maybe. You're definitely starting the tight ends, Scheffler, Pettigrew if he plays. I mean, the kicker, Jason Hanson, the Lions D. Get this. I got the Lions D off the waiver wire this week. I was stunned. But granted, they haven't been a great unit all year, but they were still on the wire for this matchup, and for me to get them is huge. So if they're out there, you definitely want to get the Lions D in your lineup this week. So again, this is guarantee central. If I'm wrong on this one, it's a shocker of the year. Lions players, got to start them this week out of what happened to the Cardinals last week in these last 9 games that have been a huge disappointment. So that's the quarterbacks this week, along with some other Lions thrown in for good measure. Running backs this week that I like. You want to continue to ride Mr. Beast mode. You want to continue to ride Marshawn Lynch after that strong performance against the Cardinals last week. Had 30 fantasy points. This week, just a good matchup going up against the Bills. Granted, Seattle, as we've said, doesn't tend to do well on the road, but I think the matchup is just too good to pass up. You're not sitting Marshawn Lynch at this point in the season, not if he's taking you to the playoffs. I think you're definitely going to keep riding him. An intriguing option this week, and probably one of the most staked free agents on the waiver wire this week, was David Wilson of the Giants. Think about this. David Wilson, earlier in the season, was in the Giants' doghouse because he was not being the player that we expected, that the team drafted him to be, the rookie that we kind of expected him to be. He was falling behind Andre Brown on the depth chart. He was 3rd and 4th on the depth chart pretty much. But then Brown breaks his leg ending his season. And now Bradshaw's got, again, that knee issue. So who knows? And now Wilson has finally emerged, had 22 fantasy points last week. If Bradshaw's knee becomes an issue and he does not play, then I think Wilson maybe becomes a very intriguing number 1, number 2 option this week going up against the Falcons. Granted, think about it. Also, the Falcons right now, at this point in the season, they don't have much to play for. They've already clinched their division. They could very well clinch the number 1 this week in home field. Once they get that out of the way, they'll have nothing left to play for. So the Giants, who still have much to play for, are going to be going at this game very, very hard. So if Bradshaw is out, David Wilson, definitely a guy I think you can plug in as a solid 1-2 option for you. Other guys, again, kind of a surprising name because this guy really has been kind of in a muddled backfield situation in New Orleans this season. Darren Sproles kind of reemerged last week. Now, granted, he had missed a lot of weeks with that broken hand earlier in the season, but finally broke out last week. Had 19 fantasy points going up against Tampa this week. Tampa's D, not exactly stellar. I think you could certainly plug him in as a number 2, number 3 guy with some upside this week. You never know, though. The risk, though, is you never know what's going to happen with the Saints' backfield. Are the Saints going to throw more in this game because Tampa's secondary is so bad? You just don't know what to expect. So maybe kind of a risk-reward thing there with Sproles. But considering his week last week, I think there's really no harm in putting him as a number 2, number 3, though, with that upside. So I think he'd be the Saints running back you want to have right now. And then you've got Thomas in the mix and Ingram. Ivory, I think, is hurt, so he's been out. So I think Sproles, though, still is the Saints running back to own right now. Again, other running backs. Alfred Morris of Washington. Again, Browns defense, awful. I think Morris is a solid number 1, number 2 option this week for you. And again, and this one, last one, running backs real quick. Again, this is kind of an oddball because it's a timeshare option that I'm going to mention. And normally with me in timeshares, I don't like timeshares because of the uncertainty that goes on in the backfield. But considering the matchup on Monday night with the Jets going up against Tennessee, I'd have to say that I'd say either Bilal Powell or Sean Green are solid number 2 options this week going up against Tennessee. I really like both of these guys this week. They both had double-digit fantasy points last week. I think that's rarely happened this season where both the Jets running backs have had double-digit fantasy weeks, and it might very well happen again this week. Both guys have looked actually pretty decent of late. Green hasn't been his sucky self of late that I railed on earlier in the year, that he should go back to Iowa. No, he's actually been fairly decent lately. So, and Powell getting most of the goal line work and scoring some touchdowns, so are putting up production. So with the matchup this week, I think both guys are solid number twos you could plug in if you have no better options at running back. So either way, I like them both this week. All right, moving on to wide receivers for the week. Again, I mentioned Pittsburgh. Again, with Big Ben back, I definitely like Mike Wallace and Antonio Brown this week. I think both guys are pretty solid matchups this week for the Dallas matchup this week. I think Wallace, you can definitely plug in as a must-start. He was one of the leading receivers in fantasy last week. You can definitely put him in as a must-start guy. And Brown, I think, is a solid number two. Again, the only risk with Brown is that he doesn't find the end zone very often. That's the only thing holding Antonio Brown back from being an elite fantasy wide receiver. He doesn't get into the end zone very often. Yeah, he's the clear number two behind Mr. 60 Minutes and Mike Wallace, but he doesn't get to the end zone, and that's what's so frustrating. I had Brown earlier in the year, and I drafted him my number two receiver, and sometimes he had good weeks, and other times he was a complete and utter bust. So that's good, but that's the thing. He doesn't get into the end zone. So, and then there was the injury, and I had to drop him because he was expendable. So now I can only see him as a number two because he doesn't find the end zone, and you want to have touchdowns in fantasy, especially this time of year. Again, I mentioned him, Danario Alexander. You got to start him against Carolina. You know, ride the hot hand. He has been insane these last few weeks now that he's healthy, now that he's in a better offense, I think, than he was in St. Louis. So definitely you want to start him this week in your playoffs. I am this week. Definitely you should do the same. Like the Tampa Bay receivers this week, in case you didn't remember, New Orleans against the pass, 31st or 32nd, one of the two. They're toward the bottom line. They're toward the bottom, literally. So I think Vincent Jackson must start this week for Tampa Bay. Williams, I can only rate him as a solid maybe number two, number three with upside because here's why. Again, he's been very inconsistent. He is only reliable when he scores touchdowns, when he finds the end zone. Last week, he only saved his fantasy day because he had a 1-yard touchdown last week. That's the thing with Williams. Again, a number two receiver who really sometimes tends to have trouble finding the end zone. So that's why I have to rate him kind of low, because he's only worthy when he scores touchdowns. It's just like Kyle Rudolph in Minnesota, who, by the way, the reverse jinx worked on him last week. I said it. I said it on here. I had him on the avoid list 2 weeks in a row. He scored touchdowns. I had him on the ride list last week. Donut. Fantasy donut for Kyle Rudolph. He's only reliable when he scores touchdowns, people. So hopefully he didn't take that risk on him. Everyone in fantasy, everyone else out there was saying, start Kyle Rudolph, start Kyle Rudolph. I did the reverse jinx donut. How about that for you? Just goes to show that some people, I know myself included, don't get it right all the time, but it's just unpredictable. You never know. But we try our best. I mentioned Philly receivers, Jeremy Maclin. Again, Foles is getting into a groove, and he's starting to become the number one receiver now that Jackson's out for the year. You know, obviously he's like spreading the ball around. Foles, we've seen, is getting more and more receivers involved. You know, this guy, that guy, this guy. He's getting people involved, but Maclin, I think, is the clear number one. So I have to rate him as a strong number two this week going up against the Bengals. And finally, you definitely want to keep riding the hot hand of Pierre Garçon. It doesn't matter if RG3 plays. It doesn't matter if Cousins plays. I think he's still the Skins' main weapon. He's been a touchdown scoring machine of late. He's a must-start this week going up against the Browns. Finally, tight ends I like this week. Again, I mentioned Philly. Interesting to know, kind of another surprise this week of one of the leading tight end scorers in fantasy this week. How about Clay Harbor of the Eagles last week? Was one of the leading scorers. It's kind of like the Charles Clay week from Miami that came out of nowhere. But Harbor caught all 6 targets last week. If you need help at tight end, if you don't like your number one's matchup this week for you, maybe Harbor, you can sneak another touchdown. He's number 2, number 3 guy you can sneak in for you this week. Greg Olsen of Carolina, I like him this week. He's getting hot at the right time. Newton's starting to look his way more often. Newton's coming back around a little bit. I like him as a decent number 2 this week going up against San Diego. Denver situation, going up against Baltimore. Peyton Manning, I think, is really going to frustrate Baltimore with the pass. I think they're going to use him a lot more often. But the thing about it at tight end is it's really frustrating on a weekly basis who Manning is going to throw to when it comes to his tight ends. One week, a couple weeks, it's Joel Dreesen. The next, Jacob Tamme gets hot. And then it's like, oh my gosh, what do you do? It's kind of like Hernandez and Gronkowski in New England. When they're both healthy, who's going to get the bulk of the throws? You know, that happened a lot, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. One week, Gronk would go off, and Hernandez would have a donut. And the next week, Gronk would have low points, and Hernandez would go off. It's so frustrating as fantasy owners when you have 2 tight ends and a strong passing offense that works so well. But I'm a firm believer in going with the hot hand, if you guys have noticed. I want to ride the guy that's going to have the hot hand. Lately, it's been Dreesen. So this week, I'm going to rate Dreesen as a number 2 option this week. I'm going to rate Tamme as more of a number 3 this week, just based on the fact of their play of late. Again, I mentioned the Lions, Tony Scheffler, Pettigrew, whoever starts at tight end, got to start him this week. And finally, again, Pittsburgh, Heath Miller this week. Remember Big Ben's comment? He said, hey, I'm going to try to get Heath Miller to the Pro Bowl. Well, that might be out the window now that Miller has regressed so much that when Big Ben wasn't his quarterback. But I think he's going to have a big bounce back week this week. I think he could be a solid number 1, number 2 option this week going up against Dallas. And finally, one quick wild card for you this week is Darren McFadden of the Raiders going up against the Chiefs. The Chiefs' D is still troubling. They still can't really stop anybody. McFadden is showing no ill effects from the ankle injuries that have plagued him. I think he's a solid number 1 option for you this week. Okay, guys, those are the guys to ride this week to hopefully ride you to playoff victories this week to get you one step closer to that championship game. Don't forget to check out the guys to avoid video as well. And good luck to you guys in Week 15 this week. We're going for it all at this point in the season. It's a critical week, and you want to have the best lineups out there possible. So, again, thank you guys so much for all your comments, questions, anything you want to talk fantasy about. I'm happy to do it when I'm available. So please feel free. And again, thank you for watching. Good luck this week.